So let's talk about HPP.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that you said like the process has changed. I never really had an issue with HPP. I actually got a comment probably, I don't know, in the past 6 months where someone sent me an email saying that they were surprised and disappointed that I didn't have a problem with HPP and that I would feed my dogs with food that had been used that process. And I was just sort of like, why are you surprised? Because I've never been one to come out with the torches against HPP. To me, if my dog can eat it, then because HPP was actually how I got Rodrigo to eat certain proteins. So when he had a beef intolerance, if he had a beef intolerance or a chicken intolerance, if the food had been HPP, for some reason, he can eat it. It may not have had anything to do with HPP. It may have been to do with some other ingredient sourcing. It could have been anything. It could have been because the moon was going in a different direction. Who knows? But it worked. And so there is a brand, We Feed Raw, that I would sometimes place an order with them for Rodrigo so he can have the food. And but you were saying that it's changed, and I can't really tell. I'm all over the place with your food because it's freeze dried. But the only thing I don't like about HPP is that the food doesn't look the way my food looks when I make it at home. It doesn't look like a ground up meat with vegetables in it. It's just, everything is just all one color. And has the HPP process changed in that aspect, or is it just other things where it's just not a true sterilization where it's killing everything off?
Well, that's a good question. And the first thing to go with Rodrigo specifically, I have a theory about that. This is just grounded in just an idea, but my theory is that, when I have talked about fermentation and saying, bacteria are pre-processing the food by kind of pre-digesting it. What they found in testing raw pet food is that 86% of the nutrients actually became more bioavailable. And so there had to have been something in that process. And I'm thinking it's the same kind of the pressure does, because they're both processing steps. So I'm thinking that the pressure, I don't want to, I guess, processes in the same way to kind of open up the nutrients in some way. And that's just kind of like my theory on that. But yeah, there's been one of the things that really opened my eyes to, the whole thing for me was obviously a pretty big journey from being, on one side of this issue to another side of this issue. And it all comes from a place of just wanting to figure out what's true or untrue. And so I'll talk about the color in a second, but I will tell you the start of my journey, which was I was at a facility that was doing HPP, and I went into so it goes in the machine and they're in like chubs, and I was always under the impression that amount of pressure would create a lot of heat. And I looked at the temperature logs of the one that was running, and it only went from 41 to 43 degrees, and I was like, oh, I was totally wrong about that.
Yeah.
What else am I wrong about? That's what started me down this journey. There's definitely there's discoloration, which is interesting because they actually use it on a lot of human ground meat now. Most of the HPP facilities are doing mostly human products. So it really just depends on the discoloration. One of the things that you would see not a lot of discolorization on is lunch meat. So like when you go buy ham and that stuff, all of that essentially is HPP'd.
Yeah.
And so I was actually at a conference recently, a workshop for HPP and freeze drying. And they actually showed liver, of different, and basically the higher the pressure is and the longer you do it, the more the more it discolors.
Okay.
So now you have where you used to have, say, a completely gray product from, when they first started doing it, they were doing much higher pressure levels and for much longer. And now it's a lower pressure level and for just under 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And there's no, so you will get some discoloration, but that doesn't necessarily, when you mix that with all the other data, when it comes to the nutrients, some nutrients being more bioavailable, you do lose some. and that you have to formulate for. Vitamin A and B vitamins essentially are what you are losing to, that you'd have to like formulate for. Like in our food, we're using obviously a lot of liver and kidney, which will bring that vitamin A up anyway. And I just basically looked at all the things that made food raw to me. So, and this is coming from someone who's not really scared of bacteria. I mean, you know, I ate 3 raw eggs, egg yolks this morning, and my raw milk for breakfast. So I'm obviously eating, I'm not too scared of it. But one of the things is it is where the industry's going. You know, give it 5 years and we'll see if almost anyone can, you know, be making non-HPP food. And so, you know, under those processes, and it is a good kill step. I mean, it is a good when it comes to pathogenic bacteria, but I was looking at nutrient content, bacteria, like good bacteria or native bacteria, and enzymes, and then digestibility. Now, digestibility is 100% the same, whether a food's HPP'd or not HPP'd. And then we looked at enzyme, and the most reduction I saw in any study was 10%. And in some of the studies it was 0%. So we know the enzymes are still active. And then the big one for me, obviously, was bacteria. Now, there's not a lot of bacteria in meat generally, like probiotic bacteria. There's obviously background flora. There's potential for pathogens, but that's not where you're looking for your probiotics necessarily. So like, especially in our formulation, right? We're not using a lot of plants. We're not adding things that are, you know, fermented or anything like that. So, you know, you don't have that. And so, but the interesting thing about that was there was a company who was developing basically a probiotic serum to get a log reduction. So what they want to do is you want to reduce pathogenic bacteria by a certain amount of logs so it's like a kill step. So they were able to get this. It turns out they're now working with kibble because you have to leave it for a long time, and no one's going to be like, I bought this raw food, I'm going to thaw it and let it sit for 2 weeks before I actually use it. But they did the testing on HPP foods. They would apply these probiotics and then they would HPP them, and the probiotics survive the process. So we know it's not a sterile food. I was just wrong about that. There was a lot of things I was wrong about. And if I was to ignore that just because I didn't want to be right, just because I wanted to be right or because I wanted to be consistent or whatever it might be, that wouldn't be science. And so totally 100% understand if somebody wants to avoid it. Saying, well, I just don't think it's raw is not an argument necessarily. You got to kind of, you know, have more than that. But if you want to avoid it, I respect that. But we just wanted to be able to put out the most relevant information, you know, as to that it is raw food and that it is an option for a lot of people. And it will help a lot of people get a lot less processed diets into their pet's bowl.
So I have a few questions about HPP, and one is, and I think I lost it. It'll come back to me. I got it. So I've always wondered, like after you guys talked about it, and I'm looking at brands who still give pushback, like they don't want to do HPP. I used to always think that brands had to buy this $1 million machine and do it themselves. Are you sending it out to someone else to do the process?
Ours is done in-house. Most people, it's sent out.
Okay.
Most people, it's sent out. A lot of people, it's a really interesting world when you get into it, because there's a lot of companies that don't necessarily even formulate their own products or anything like that. And then they're made somewhere else. And it's just an interesting, you know, what drives me is the formulation part and, you know, putting those things out. So that wouldn't really be what I want to do. But even if you're like most of those facilities, let's say you're made at someone else's facility that does freeze drying, even those facilities don't have the HPP in them. I just toured 2 facilities, and it was an HPP facility, and it was a big facility in Nebraska that made freeze dried foods. Like they do formulation, a lot of other stuff, and they send it out to the freeze drying people. So not even this huge facility had it. So there's basically like a couple companies that do this, and then it just kind of depends on that. And I will add too that it's just our meat products that are HPP. So nothing else, you know, the greens aren't, the milk, obviously, the fermented blends, anything like that. So. And
also the other thing was, I remember when HPP was, you know, everyone so angry about it. The big message was, no, it's only the poultry that's HPP, nothing else is. And so is that narrative shifting where it's just gonna, companies that use HPP are just gonna apply it to everything that they're doing?
I think probably. I mean, it's kind of an interesting marketing thing to be like, we think this is worse, so we just do it on this thing. And here's this other thing. That's kind of an interesting way to look at it. But that was the whole point of what we were talking about, was it's not a bad process. And we know now that the food is raw, et cetera. So if people want to do it, great. And if they don't, great as well. But I think you will find it'll be harder to do that as time goes on, just because I think the FDA is really looking more into raw food now, and are starting to set and make some regulations and do things a little bit differently. And so we want to be able to make the food, obviously.
Yeah.
So
yeah,